Welcome to the episode 7 of the Engineering Construction podcasts. And this episode is about climate change and the game changer for engineering construction projects worldwide. My name's John Fotherby. I'm from Kingsfield Academy. And on this podcast, Alex Johnson, Josh Graham, and Carmen Velasco. So, Carmen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. So I'm Carmen Velasco. I'm a managing partner at Kingsfield Academy. I'm a barrister by training. Started in Spain almost 30 years ago as an urban development lawyer. Then moved to the UK more than 20 years ago, and I have been doing consulting in areas as contracting, contract management, support in arbitration, claims, etc., in the engineering and construction world.
And Alex?
Hello, yeah, I'm Alex Johnson. I'm a partner with the law firm Freeths. I specialize in construction and engineering dispute resolution. I've been doing that for what feels like a long time, almost 20 years, at various different law firms. And I specialize in cross-border projects, mainly in the oil and gas, energy, and infrastructure sectors.
And Josh?
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm Josh Graham. So I'm the founder of EHAB, which is a tech company founded in the UK in 2020, now operating globally. We have over 200 construction projects that we use our weather and climate risk modeling tool to assist on. So a very topical topic for today. We work with many of the largest contractors in the UK, now working in Canada, North America, and Europe as well. So thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, great, Josh. And perhaps we start with you. If you talk to us a little bit about, the research that you've been doing over the years and what that's revealing and the impact that the climate change is having for construction projects worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone probably is well aware that the weather is changing. I don't think that's in any dispute or debate, really. There's pretty severe changes happening to our weather system. So as the world warms, unfortunately, we've kind of hit our 1.5 degree, and that's likely still to rise. That means that there is more moisture. So 7% more moisture for every degree of heating can be held in the atmosphere. And what does that mean? It means rain, and not just more rain, but more sharper bursts of it. So more severe flooding events, and of course then wildfires, heat events, lots of things that are having severe impacts on health, but of course on project budgets and timelines as well. And the research that we specifically released in 2024 was trying to get a sense of what were people actually feeling on the ground in actual construction projects. Because I think there's been this kind of maybe mythos that, if winters are getting warmer, then great, we have more time to do concrete pours and the like. And perhaps there was an extent to which that was true in 2010. But now I don't think that's true. So we interviewed about 200 folks across the project controls, scheduling space globally. So there was a good mix of people. About 50% of folks were from North America and Europe, but then rest of the world got to weigh in as well. And so there was lots of different opinions and perspectives. And really, probably the kind of obvious thing was that everyone agreed that weather was a really big risk. But the most scary part was the difference in action. So and you probably see this in lots of cases where people perceive and think of it as a problem, but then there's a significant drop in terms of people actually doing something about it. So I think, today we're probably going to get into the nuts and bolts of maybe we see it as a problem, but how does that actually translate into the contract or into other things that we're doing? And probably, the reason that we got reconnected, John, was I think I sent out something which spoke about in 2020, about 45% of construction projects were facing delays because of weather. And then this is 2024, so I'll be excited but I'm also scared to see the research for 25. But about 93% of projects are now delayed. So there's practically a doubling of that risk in 5 years, and that really stays true to the data we're seeing as well. Just the hockey stick curve that we've probably all seen, where things are moving in the wrong direction and more steeply. So really, that's the research we did in 24 is the foundation of what we want to talk about today.
Right, great, thanks, Josh. So just thinking about your report, Josh's report, what's your view, Alex, on from a legal contractual point of view of what's different now, given that shift in climate change conditions, in terms of how we should deal with this contractually?
Yeah, I think this is an area that standard form construction contracts don't deal with any differently to how they dealt with it 10 or 20 years ago. There really hasn't been much development around climate clauses, should we call it. And the concept is basically, irrespective of the form of contract, the contractor is expected to take a certain amount of risk for the weather as part of a construction project. And classically, there is relief for a contractor if the weather is exceptionally adverse. And all of the contracts deal with that in a similar way. There are various differences. For example, both the FIDIC contract and the NEC form of contract tried to benchmark it by historical weather data. But the basic concept is weather which we weren't expecting has happened, and therefore the project is delayed. Therefore, contractor is entitled to an extension of time is the basic principle. I think the problem that the issues Josh has identified is that weather which we might used to have called exceptional is now becoming more frequent, and it's also becoming more severe, and it's becoming more severe more often, and the contracts really aren't designed for that. I can see a counter argument where if a contractor is saying, well, there was a period of very wet weather and that delayed us from doing the work. If that project is in the UK, there's no way that's going to be exceptionally adverse. And the more severe winter storms we have, the more true that will be. It seems that these sort of exceptionally adverse type clauses might well apply if your Saudi project, you suddenly have a monsoon when you're expecting 50-degree heat in the summer. Yeah, I can understand that, but it's none of these things are very practical, and so I just think the clauses we have are probably not fit for purpose, and there needs to be far more thought given to how a contractor gets relief on a project when the weather is so severe that, well, not only does it delay and disrupt the project, but in the worst case, it causes health and safety risks.
Yeah, and I think the contracts assume a certain amount, today's contracts assume a certain amount of predictability about the weather, when in reality, the predictability is at best uncertain due to frequency and severity. Would that be a fair position, Josh?
Absolutely.
From your research? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, Carmen, if we look at this from a civil code jurisdiction position, what's greatly different from the view that Alex has on this issue? Or are there some similarities in terms of the problems with contractually and legally?
I think probably the approach is different, but the practicalities are the same. Because the situation at the end ends up being with contracts that are not fit for purpose. So what happens in civil code jurisdiction is that usually it can happen two things. Either the weather conditions are part of the contract, because in civil law jurisdictions the law gives the party the freedom to allocate risks, and one of the risks is weather. So the parties can allocate it. But if the contract is silent, then it goes to the civil code. The civil code, and for example in Spain, a different type of law that is the health and safety law. And it has a big impact because it may. So this law it has precedence over whatever the contract says If it says something, and if it doesn't, then it's part of it, and it's quite important. And then when the contract says something, usually in civil code jurisdictions, it has two options to deal with the weather conditions, either with a clause that is related to weather, or if there is nothing, it goes to force majeure. But then it has different type of problems in order to use these two clauses. But this is usually the way is dealt with.
Right. And we have to say that when we talk about civil code, we also have to draw distinctions between the different countries that are in the overall civil code regime, which may treat this problem slightly differently, even though the principles remain the same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, principles are the same. The way they deal with it changes a little bit, but yeah.
Josh, you were talking about interviews with project controls people, I guess planning, scheduling, that sort of team. How are they dealing with that from your perspective these days? How are they dealing with the changing climate conditions in terms of planning the work?
Yeah, well, I think what we found in the research, right, was there was that gap in perception and action. And, there's some recommended practices that are out there by the AACE and various organizations which state different methodologies that you might want to use to make sure that you're factoring in weather risk into your schedule. So it does, take away climate change for a second. Weather was, of course, always a problem and always something that you would ideally be adding contingency and modeling that risk to the extent that was appropriate for your project, so that you make sure that you have a realistic schedule. That's obviously pretty beneficial. We obviously do a lot of ongoing research and speak to lots and lots of planners and schedulers, and I'm not going to name any names, but most people were not meeting those recommended practices in the first place. So, when you already have relatively, I would say, mediocre practices, and it's not through anyone's fault, it's easier to do it in that way than, go the full way of grabbing data and modeling it and putting it into your schedule in an appropriate way. Obviously, that's a problem anyway. But then you add on the fact that climate change is then changing that baseline so much so that you can't get away with it as much. I think what we're seeing is people having to find creative ways. If they can't claim it in the contract, like you were saying, Alex, if they aren't able to justify why it, obviously under NEC, it's the 1 in 10, and that should be a relatively data-driven mechanism. But wind speeds aren't included in that. So even if you do have these storm events that maybe do add some rain to your to kind of the site and make it delays you in that regard, it might have been the fact that it was actually the crane was the issue, and therefore you're not covered by that. So I think what we're seeing is kind of people having quite quickly realizing that they need to take a better approach, which is why we work with lots of organizations and help them try and put these standard practices in place. I think the final thing I'll say on it, John, though, is big companies are losing lots of money on this for sure. And the thing that is really difficult for people to understand is how do you, if it's not a full day that is lost, if it's just productivity, how do you actually account for that? So it's easy to make the statement that, we had a storm and therefore we lost 2 days, because it's quite obvious, it's quite in your face. But I think a lot of what we're seeing from a data perspective and speaking with planners is it's a death by 1,000 cuts, where actually you're losing thousands here and there that you never really account for because it's not really claimable under the contract. And so because of that fact, you don't record it in as effective a way as possible. I could talk about this all day, but I'll leave it there, I think.
So that really takes us to two of the things that you bang on about endlessly, Alex and Carmen, and that is about contract management and compliance and records.
Yep.
And therefore, and you both said that the contracts today, in the face of climate change, are not fit for purpose. So that's one thing that we have to address, is how do we deal with these things contractually and the modifications that need to be made to standard form contracts in this respect? And then the second thing is, how do you get through to people that, on the basis of what Josh has said, you need regular weather reports on a daily basis that actually record what has happened, and more importantly, the effect of what has happened. So, over to you. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my view is, I think actually the way that contractors deal with this practically is a lot better than what the contract says. For example, the offshore industry is very good about having daily weather records because those are necessary. But the FIDIC contracts that everybody uses for offshore projects are not fit for purpose, and so they have to be substantially amended to make them work. But nonetheless, the practices are there. So those records and data are being kept because if waves are of a certain height, if tidal conditions are of a certain type, if weather is at a certain level, then it's not safe for those vessels to operate. Therefore, the contractor has to get time and money compensation. So the offshore philosophy seems to me more advanced than the onshore philosophy. And so I would say that that similar kind of thinking has to apply to onshore construction projects as well. And actually, it should be health and safety driven, really. I mean, for example, in Middle East construction projects, there are, again, safe operating limits in the summer. There will be days when the site is simply red flagged and nobody can work because it's too hot. Or there'll be days where the criteria is slightly less, and that means a certain number of hours with a certain number of water breaks, but that's it. And so again, that's quite a practical way of doing it, and is probably what needs to happen. But those are exceptions rather than the rule. And I think they need to become more the rule by reference to the site itself. What are the particular risks? If you're doing a construction project in Southern California, it's heat and potential fire. And the contract in the project has to be set up to deal with those kind of things. So it requires more of an interrogation of risk, I think, about climate and what that means. And then factoring that into the contract and making sure the records are kept and that the contract is administered in the right way. I think that's where it needs to head.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether, in fact, we talked about a range of circumstances now, about torrential rain, wind, heat, fire. I mean, how many other things can go wrong? So it was just making me think, this isn't affecting an individual party to a contract. It's affecting a project.
Yeah.
And that, therefore, I just wonder whether, in fact, there needs to be some rethinking about the risk taking here and who is taking that risk. Yeah. And Carmen, what's your thoughts from a civil code point of view from that on that basis?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because usually in civil code jurisdictions, what the judge is going to do is going to look at the historical data, and the problem is that the historical data in this case, in these cases, are totally useless. We are in a completely different situation. So I agree with Alex. Records. It's very important. You have a chance to show whoever is going to decide, the judge or the arbitrator, that you can't actually be looking at the historical data. This is a completely different game. And then when I always say that the time that you spend negotiating a contract and thinking what kind of risks you are taking it's the time that you are going to save later on. So you better get it right at the beginning and understand what risk are you taking. Currently, you are not taking the same risk than you were taking 6 years ago, 10 years ago. Think careful and think whether you are in a position to take them. Lately, everyone is taking risks, thinking, okay, I'm going to pass them down. It's not good enough. So that's my
usually
approach.
Passed down to the most incompetent
exactly
party with the least amount of resources to be able to deal with the problem. And this is my point, that we're looking at something that's affecting the project and everybody involved with it. So should we have a different thinking about how we deal with the risks for the project? And I mean, there is the question, who is liable here, who's taking the risk on time. But as you mentioned earlier, Josh, in your summing up of the research, it's costing companies a lot of money. So how do we equitably deal with that then from a project risk point of view, rather than an individual party point of view? What's your thoughts, Alex?
I suppose I would urge the parties to step back and see the bigger picture, because ultimately owners do projects because they want some asset that generates revenue, and contractors do construction projects because they want to get paid for doing them. So in a sense, their interests are basically the same. They both want the project done, but for different reasons. Now, if they're in a location where, looking at how things currently are, the climate is going to impact the project in certain ways, it doesn't seem to me right for the contractor to simply carry that risk on a time-only basis without any financial compensation for it. Because if you took it to its extreme, you'd bankrupt contractors.
Yeah.
If the weather became so bad that projects could never be completed, contractors wouldn't exist, and the whole point of it would fall apart. So stepping back and, with owners, from looking at it from the perspective of, well, how do I get my project completed overall in the quickest way and in the most efficient way and in a safe way? There is a logic to say that some of the risk for climate events should be shared, and that contractors should be compensated.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on that, Carmen?
Yeah, I totally agree with Alex. When there is nothing written in the contract, then I think the common goal is to finish the contract, finish the project, and start working. And so it's for both parties' interest to actually finish and be rewarded and compensated.
So therefore, what we're basically saying is, given what's happening climate-wise, that any investment in an engineering construction project, the effects on time and money of climate change would be part of the investment consideration, just like the cost of materials or equipment or engineering or anything else. It's a cost that has to be borne for that investment. And that seems to me to be sort of fair. What I can see from the other side, if you try to artificially set a benchmark, so I think what you've said from both jurisdiction perspectives is that there's no real benchmark as we anticipated with the conventional contracts that we've been looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got no benchmark, that must be fertile ground for dispute that becomes unsolvable. Because what's the measurement? How do you assess it? How do you determine? What's the extent of the risk taken by either party in this respect? Why don't we just dispense with that nonsense and say it's part of life, it's part of the project, let's write contracts that deal with it in that way, and that those, the time impact and cost impact of climate change is part of the project investment, and that's the end of it. That's just how life is. I think that's the game-changing situation, isn't it?
I think there is something in that, and I do agree with you, John. I think if you're trying to benchmark the weather, it is a recipe for disputes. But that's not really the point, I don't think. The point is, I think, a more specific one. So, for example, if you have a bunch of cranes on a site, you know that those cranes can only operate up to a certain wind speed, and after that, it's not safe.
Yeah.
So that's what drives the compensation, in my view. If the wind exceeds the operating limits for the crane, that's when there's compensation. So you could take that to other principles, it seems to me. So that's why I would say it should be driven from a health and safety perspective about what's safe and what are the safe limits for the work.
Yeah, and that's what you were saying, Josh, earlier, I think, is that the big problem is health and safety. Regardless of whether it's cranes or any other construction activity, it just becomes dangerous in these conditions for people to continue working. And that must be, I completely agree with that. That must be the prime consideration. I was just thinking of the aftermath after we've, everything's been finished and the disputes are mounting, that let's try and eliminate one of them at least.
Yeah, I think more thought upon contingency for climate related delay is absolutely a good idea.
Yeah,
because there will be some.
So Josh, from your research and your discussions with people, how do you think those ideas would go down?
Yeah, well, I think, what Carmen said earlier about people being able to assess and come together and actually forecast more meaningfully at the beginning and spend the time doing that exercise, and that leading through to, having value for all parties, I think is something that we really need to adopt, because I still see, we work with lots of contractors and some clients. I still see that, like you mentioned, John, oh, well, that weather thing in the contract, it's their risk. So actually, I don't need to pay for this because it's not going to benefit me, even though, as you said, whether there's late fees or you've got a project that you want to deliver and you want it to start generating revenue, the weather is going to happen. And if you don't model it and understand what the potential normal parameters are and what the edges of the lower and upper bounds are, then it becomes really difficult to make decisions on, well, do I need to have an extra crane or an extra mitigation in place and have the budget available for that to be able to actually progress forward? So I think the most enlightened contractors and clients we're working with are saying, actually, hang on a minute, yeah, it's within the interest of the project, whether that's an alliance form of contract or whatever it might be, but they're taking the realization of, oh, well, let's model it. Let's give ourselves the full suite of understanding of where we could take decisions, even if we don't like that number, even if it says we'll actually need an extra 5 million in the contingency pot, even if that's scary. Well, that's what we've got a mathematical model. We've proven that it's 94% accurate. If that's what it's saying, you can't hide away from that. That doesn't mean that all that risk is going to happen, but it's more just making sure that you've got the contingency in case it does, so that you're not scrambling and embarrassing yourself with a lack of budget afterwards. So I think, I hope the majority of the long tail of the industry starts to catch up with that. But clearly there's always those who are kind of at the head of the game and thinking about this in a more data-driven way. And so we've just got to keep shouting about those stories and showing why it benefits all parties.
Yeah. And not only budget, but also time, because when they are planning, when they are doing their schedules, they have to have this in mind. Otherwise, everything is like no project is going to be on time. So you have to be realistic.
So in closing, Alex, have you anything else to say about this from a contractual legal point of view?
I think I would just make the point that, and this is a wider point anyway, be careful if just adopting the standard form, because it doesn't always do what you want it to. And think about areas that need to be tailored for the project and the risks that the project poses. And climate risk ought to be one of those. Yeah.
So thanks very much, everybody. And for you watching and listening to this, if you want to know more about this story and how it's evolving and how you can help yourselves to protect your projects effectively from the consequences of climate change, then get in contact and we're happy to talk to you. So thanks and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.